Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study and a faculty member in the program in the history of science, technology, and medicine. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you back from spring break. This is a reason to come back from spring break. And because IAS Thursdays is a site for ideas, conversations, and viewpoints from a wide range of scholars to be heard in the heart of the university, and in turn is designed for scholars from all walks of life. I'll just briefly describe myself. I'm a 60-ish woman with gray hair and glasses, and we're happy to have all of you here today. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that all of us, no matter where we're coming from today, are located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The University of Minnesota's Twin Cities campus resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 51. So the Institute for Advanced Study acknowledges that this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is just one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and with each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. We have a few announcements today. Next week's IAS Thursday is the next installment of the Spotlight series, a collaboration of Northrop, the University Honors Program, and the IAS. This month's event will focus on voter access and agency and election security. So this is a hybrid event. You can join us online via Zoom, or you can also come to Northrop and join us in person in the Best Buy Theater on the 4th floor of Northrop. The IAS has a number of research and creative collaboratives that are offering exciting events in the upcoming weeks, and we recommend that you explore these offerings via the event calendar on the IAS website. In general, if you'd like to hear more about the events and opportunities at the Institute for Advanced Study, sign up for our newsletter. You can visit our website to sign up, or online attendees can check the chat for a link to sign up. And before we go further into the program, as I'm sure all of you have done many times now, I just want to offer a few technical instructions for our audience members. We do have a captioner working with us today, and to enable captions, click on the live transcript button that is commonly located on the bottom Zoom menu bar if you're on a desktop computer, or in the upper right on a mobile device, and then select Show Subtitles. We will have some time for audience questions at the end of today's event. If you have questions for our speakers at any time, you can enter them through the Zoom Q&A feature, also that little double balloon caption on the bottom menu bar. You can enter them at any time during the presentation and the conversation, but we won't be reading them to the panelists until the end of our presentation. If you want to introduce yourself or share resources throughout the event, we recommend using the chat feature on the menu bar, and please be sure to select everyone when you send your message. So let me just remind you, enter questions into the Q&A box and anything else into the chat box. So today's event is a partnership of the Institute for Advanced Study and the Heritage Studies and Public History program. And we're very happy about this partnership, and also grateful to our additional co-sponsors, which include the Department of African American and African Studies, the History Department, the Ridges Center, Race, Indigeneity, Disability, Gender, and Sexuality Studies in the College of Liberal Arts, and the Humphrey School's Masters of Urban and Regional Planning program, and last but not least, the University Libraries DASH program, Digital Arts, Sciences, and Humanities. So without further delay, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Greg D'Onofrio, who is an associate professor in the School of Architecture and the director of the Heritage Studies and Public History program. So welcome, and over to you, Greg.
Thanks for that introduction, Jennifer. My name is Greg D'Onofrio. I am wearing a blue shirt. I'm a mid-40s man. I wear glasses and have dark curly hair. Before I introduce her, I'd like to say how delighted I was that Dr. Andrea Roberts accepted my invitation to speak with us today at the University of Minnesota. I'll confess that I've had a somewhat uncomfortable relationship to historic preservation, the discipline that I study and practice. I say uncomfortable because, as many scholars and practitioners have noted, the historic preservation movement in the United States has traditionally worked to preserve places of historic significance that are valued by white Americans, and it has overlooked or ignored the historic sites treasured by BIPOC communities. Preservationists have also traditionally used their own expert judgments to understand the history of the built environment. Dr. Andrea Roberts brings a very different approach to understanding historic sites through the eyes of the people who care most about them, and I'm really inspired by her work. So with that, I'll introduce Dr. Roberts. Dr. Andrea Roberts is an assistant professor of urban planning at Texas A&M University. She is a fellow with the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center, Center for Heritage Conservation, and the Africana Studies program. Her 12 years of nonprofit and government administration, political campaign, and community development experience inform her efforts to move disappearing Black communities facing sprawl, displacement, and resource extraction from the margin to the center of public discourse and research. As director of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, she trains student researchers, volunteers, and the Freedom Colony diaspora to contribute places, histories, and memories to the TXFCP Study and Atlas, Texas Freedom Colonies Study and Atlas, a publicly accessible map and settlement database. The Texas Department of Transportation and the Council of Texas Archaeologists uses the platform to identify Black historic resources at risk. Dr. Roberts is also the consultant owner of Freedom Colonies Project, LLC, which provides research and DEIA workshops for preservation organizations. She is a Texas State Board of Review member and a National Monument Audit Advisory Board member. She has received awards for her engagement scholarship from the Vernacular Architecture Forum and the Urban Affairs Association. Dr. Roberts is a 2020-2021 Whiting Public Engagement Fellow and was a 2020 visiting scholar at Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Currently, she's writing a book about Black historic preservation practice for the University of Texas Press. Please help me welcome Dr. Andrea Roberts.
Thank you so much for having me. And I feel really privileged to be a part of this series, the Institute for Advanced Studies series. Before I begin, I'm Andrea Roberts, and I have long brown dreadlocks. I'm a 40-ish African-American woman. So with that, I will share screen and begin. So I come to you today to talk about reconstructing Black worlds, counter-narrative creation as preservation practice. I'll talk first about what I mean by narrative and counter-narrative and why I think they're so significant to just preservation work. I'll talk about freedom colonies, the particular type of geography in which I've focused my work so far. I'll talk about the practice of counter-narrative creation, the anatomy of project, the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, and the implications for the research and what I've learned thus far. I want to give you some context for what I mean when I talk about narrative. I want to ground our conversation about narrative as an active force in the building of social, political, and physical worlds in the moment. World building is a very contemporary approach to speculating and envisioning place and has long been with us, while the story or narrative is often a medium for sentimental tropes, exploitation, or manipulation, it is also, I argue, a medium for showing ourselves to ourselves. Stories then are not about wrestling over the truth. Fundamentally, storytelling and narratives are about meaning, worth, validation, and power. And so when I speak of narrative, I'm speaking about reinforcing or elucidating a given belief truth. A counter narrative then disputes those commonly held assumptions about the nature of reality, identity, place, positionality, and the political moment. And these ideas infuse themselves into our so-called scientific processes, academic deliberation and scholarship creation, finance, education. Every aspect of our lives is implicated by this idea of the narrative, the counter narrative. And of course, we're all familiar with dominant foundational narratives, such as this one depicted by this painting, American Progress by John Gast, which really depicts sort of the westward expansion in the United States. It sort of posits that there's a purity and a righteousness to the westward expansion of land and dominion over not only the land, but the peoples in that land is depicted in this image. So when I speak of counter narratives, I speak of them as existing then at the intersection of race, our public history, and preservation. And I speak of it when I say of a moment, I am speaking maybe about the last 5 or 6 years in which we've had the events of Charlottesville, the 1619 Project forcing a reckoning with race in public history. We've had the murder of George Floyd, which has heightened awareness of systemic racism in some areas. However, 3% of all of our National Register listings represent African-American heritage and only 3% of Latinx heritage. To give you some perspective, the listings cumulatively amount to about 96,000 properties in the United States. There's a lack of BIPOC enrollment in historic preservation academic programs that is largely broadly in the United States, and a lack of representation in organizational leadership. We can move then to planning. And what you see here is a diagram of professional experience. So think of it as a diagram of a practice story, if we think of John Forster's work. So here we see what I observed in my professional life in urban planning and housing in Houston, as well as Philadelphia. When we think of Black communities, the particular vantage point at which most planners are trained to think of Black communities is to think of how do we identify that individual that the pejorative might be token, but in other ways, we might just think of them as the gatekeeper to engagement. What is the convenient person, individual organization that we depend on as a gateway into Black communities? We have issues of how we conceive of place and how we define a legitimate place, either by statute, by local or state government code. But on the local level, that often posits us as living in Black blocks and corridors, and that our greatness is about times that have long gone. It's about memorialization of our past. And when I'm saying what it's about, I'm talking about these fundamental assumptions informing the ways in which government planning acts. African Americans are thought to be products of or part and parcel of inner cities primarily. Their aesthetics are often not part of what we construct as legitimate, historically significant aesthetics in terms of buildings or settlement patterns. And planning is often trained to think of how do we find the one-size-fits-all solution. And with all of that, that brings us to preservation and the state of preservation. And the state of preservation and our open dialogue or contemplation of inclusion in preservation. And so when you think of narratives, they often are the way they are because of the lack of representation of individuals in the conversation, in public space, in public history. And with poor engagement, you then have incomplete public histories and invisibility. With poor engagement, you have structural barriers to inclusive participation and leadership, and independent movements often arise, as many have, in rebellion. And so in Texas, we've had individuals who have been working for years to get Juneteenth recognized as a holiday. As early as the 1980s, this effort began, and only recently did we see some headway on that. So if we look more broadly about where we see counter narratives, where they show up in our spheres of influence, we would look to, in the center, status narratives, which tell us who we are about our national identity. In our political discourse, our narratives influence where we allocate and how we allocate funds, who's deserving, who doesn't deserve. That comes from these narratives informed by assumption. Context statements. Let's get to the nitty gritty of those of you who are engaged in historic preservation, practice, or scholarship. National Register designations, markers, ordinances, context statements are pregnant with not just independent historical dates and facts, but also these assumptions, these narratives. And then leadership, organizational cultures are pregnant with narratives that inform the insider and outsider status. And so what I argue today fundamentally is that preservation needs to foreground Black, Indigenous, and people of color's counter narratives to address disparities in the field and in the way that we manage and preserve the built environment. Narratives over the past few years have meant the difference between a life and death, the assumptions about who deserves to do what in public, where to be, where to live. Narratives reveal or hide injustice or erase or illuminate inequity, and counter narratives from the margins often reveal new publics, disparities, needs, and new policy ideas. And counter narratives, I argue should be harnessed and translated to the policy space's data. That is, what we may casually determine is simply a story is often a narrative or counter narrative that needs some translation to be validated in the policy space to have the agency it needs to make change. And so I want to talk about this, of course, in the context of this particular type of geography, but I want to also give you context for my interest in historic African-American settlements, also known as freedom colonies, also known as Black settlements, also known as freedmen's settlements, freedmen's communities. I'm interested in Black agency. I'm interested in what is a free Black place and how is it that our fields of urban planning, regional planning, rural planning, historic preservation, public history, how do we identify, cultivate, protect, honor, and support free Black places and their constituents? And this quote really, I think, personifies or wraps up my thinking about this subject. New Africa diaspora scholars are concerned with diasporic survivals and adaptations, but also are rightly concerned with the vehicles for freedom and independence. Escape is one thing, but how did maroon and free communities rationalize or conceptualize freedom and institutionalize self-government? And I study this not just as looking for the remnants of the past in a historical sense, but I'm interested in what it is we do with that information to address disparities and Black agency in the present. To contextualize again, freedom colonies, we are able to talk about African-American historic settlements, Black settlements, often in the framework of the Black town. And there's a lot of language that causes us to only think of Black settlements as valid once we call them towns, or if we give them the town moniker, that makes them valid. And that emerges from our popular imagination, which emerges from documentation. If you can document, then you are valid. And so Seneca Village, New York, very little documentation and remnants in the landscape. Took some time to bring that counter narrative of Central Park to the surface. New Philadelphia, Illinois, some documentation, an actual plat, an actual map of landowners. Rosewood, Florida, Nicodemus, Kansas, Edenville, Florida, Allensworth, California. These are places with which we're most familiar due to documentation and ways in which this has filled our popular consciousness. Freedom colonies, however, founded 1865 to 1930 and known by several names, emerged out of a need to create safe communities. And by virtue of what I mean by safe is often undetectable. So the great irony then, as you think about this endeavor I have of visualizing and making the invisible visible, is that these were places that didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be identified. They began as rural clusters of landowners. While 2% of all landowners in Texas were African-American in 1870, by 1900, 31% of landowners in Texas were African-American. The way that we know that these places existed, there's churches, there's schools, there's homesteads, cemeteries, these remnants in the landscape that we often think separately, we think about or fetishize even the individual building, but disconnect it from the meaning it holds in terms of a larger landscape or a place. And only by understanding fully the role of these institutions and landscape features can we understand the anatomy of the place. There are some 557 freedmen's towns or settlements in Texas alone. Those are the names of places, and the work of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project is to identify then or triangulate with different forms of knowledge or data the existence of these places either in the past or the present. And place definition is very much rooted in the collective belief that a community existed, and thus the interest in narratives and in story to substantiate or reconstitute these places in our present consciousness. And very often, aging descendants are the people who hold this intangible heritage and are able to define place in their memories and their stories. And often we have to think about three, or I argue there are three dimensions of threats to the survival of these places: vulnerability, visibility, and access. What happened to these places? How could there be so many and suddenly not be so many? Well, I mentioned before that they did not want to be found. If they went to the courthouse and actually declared that they owned land, they became targets of vigilante and racial violence. They were resented for accumulating land and property, especially after the Civil War. And then during the Jim Crow era, there was another wave of repression, right? And so this forced the Great Migration and a migration from more rural areas. Predominantly, Texas Freedom Colonies were in rural, but not all of them were in rural areas. But many of those individuals migrated to areas with what they perceived as greater opportunity and political freedom. Annexation of these communities swallowed them up. Urban renewal destroyed some of the last remaining markers. Interstate highways bifurcated many of these communities. And suburbanization caused an urban exodus from those early, more urban communities. And even in suburban spaces, we know that many planned communities are simply created atop historic African-American settlements. And with all of this exodus of population and disconnection from these communities, you have deferred maintenance and you have a decline in building integrity, which leads to the invisibility of these places and a reliance on intangible heritage. And then we have these real big picture examples of that invisibility, vulnerability, and access. We have municipal underbounding in places like Sand Branch outside Dallas. We have land dispossession. We have disasters and hazards in places in freedom colonies because they were disproportionately founded in areas susceptible to flooding and vulnerable to disaster, because often that was the only land available. In Texas, we had an 1866 Texas Homestead Act. African Americans, because of the Black codes passed shortly thereafter, were not able to take advantage of that Homestead Act because the Black codes passed by the state legislature stipulated that African Americans could not take advantage of publicly owned land. So as a consequence, we have land systematically land made available that sets them up to be more vulnerable to disaster and hazards. And preservation practice and policy in many ways inhibits a perspective that would determine that these places are significant or worthy of recognition or protection. So we have these challenges of visibility, of access, of vulnerability. And then we have what Laura Jane Smith, I'm sure you all are familiar with, Laura Jane's work on authorized heritage. And if we look at authorized heritage and the way it informs not only preservation, but in some ways formal planning, we have decision makers and engagement that happens through government bodies. We have structured consultation projects, Section 106 review, for example. We have experts, we have documentation, we have planning standards of what makes a place, significance and integrity as the preservation standards, architectural based assessments, and what Laura Jane, not Laura Jane Smith, but Betsy Sweet, the planning scholar, writes about as God's eye view, a set of values of what is legitimate. And so descendants' heritage and planning, conversely, that I found in Freedom Colonies, often happens through oral tradition or through the work of predominantly women known as kin keepers. Documentation in the way that it happens here is often through stories, memory, assemblage, embodiment, tenancy in common. Low population means they fall off maps, and without a concentration of population, they no longer become places in which we, or by which we orient our driving. They fall off maps. And preservation standards then are much more based on beliefs, meaning values. And so I became interested in these freedom colonies very indirectly, and very much I started with an interest in historic Black cemeteries and my own family cemetery. And in the course of reading about these cemeteries and mutual aid societies that were effective in supporting Black cemeteries early on, I began to learn about Black settlements and freedom colonies. And I learned about all of those things that I just shared with you, all of these impediments and blocks to progress. And amidst all of that, I was invited out to Deep East, Texas to see what a real life historic Black settlement was doing to address those kind of issues. And so you see on this map, Jasper and Newton counties on the border with Louisiana. So this is in 2014 when I initially started the research. My first case study work was in this context. And I found this great contrast. The dominant narrative, as soon as you say Jasper County or Jasper in Texas, we immediately think of the very real James Byrd dragging death that occurred here. But through my tours led by descendant communities in the area, what I hadn't learned before is a counter narrative of the fact that not only was he dragged down a street called Huff Creek, but Huff Creek was also an African-American settlement, and that he was dragged down where on one side of the road was this chapel that was once a Rosenwald School, but on the other side of this road, across from that sign, is a cemetery. And so there's a counter narrative that is not about denying the existence of this murder, but the double indignity of dragging him down a road where a Black settlement was and leaving his body there. And then also the fact of a historic Black settlement that existed in this context. And I was invited there not to go to that spot, right, that moment, but to go to Shankleville, where I saw or witnessed the way that they deployed narrative to counter the idea that these communities are lost and that they're still worth protecting. So I went to their festival, which took place on the grounds that you see depicted here. This is the community core. You drive down, these roads, enveloped by forest and, over reservoirs, and you end up in this very sparsely populated community of 50 households. And at the church, every year is what's called a homecoming celebration. At the homecoming celebration, this is when the descendant community That is, those who are descended from the founders of these communities return. And they return for a few different reasons. In Shankleville, they commemorate the story of their founder, Jim and Winnie Shankle. Jim was sold away, or rather, Winnie was sold away to a master in Texas. They were originally in Mississippi. And Jim swam 3 great rivers to reunite with her at the stream, or rather at the spring that you see at the very bottom of the spring where Harold Odom from Houston is standing. He is a descendant of Jim and Winnie Shankle, as are all of the individuals on the right-hand side. So they're coming from Orange, from Beaumont. They engage in homestead preservation. They come back to also collect money to fund stewardship of cemeteries. And the individuals standing behind the table are from other freedom colonies throughout those 2 counties. And so there's an active network. And I kept going back, and I would see people coming as far as from New York City, or the woman in red at the top who came all the way from Australia because it was on her bucket list to go back to this community that she had heard about only from relatives. And so this storytelling was not just about sentimentality, but I saw that it was a catalyst for return and for action. And I also saw that this memory, this mapping of memory in the landscape, this embodiment of memory during celebrations in which people would stand and commemorate place, was largely attributed to women's memory and women's kin-keeping. And so there were all manner of forms of oral traditions that I witnessed that had various functions. There was testimony, there were group accounts, there were visions, there were oral histories, there were proverbs, there were poetry, there's foundational stories, origin stories of place, songs, reminiscence that all emerged from all of these different ways in which people commemorated places, which functions as catalysts of proof of resilience, organizational development, all of these ways that people like Leonie Sandercock talks about the utility of storytelling. And so I found that these stories fostered an attachment to place, encouraged participation in planning and preservation community building, which did catalyze real planning outcomes of reinvestment, of recognition, protection, and cultural sustainability. And so I want to know, was this just about Shankleville, or was this about several freedom colonies? What was the role of story in freedom colonies? That was what I started out thinking about. So in 2015, I held this testimony service along as part of the Texas Purple Hole Pea Festival in Shankleville. You see individuals there who live in Houston, who live in Independence Heights in Houston, who live part-time in Houston, who live part-time in Jasper, individuals from all over who participated in this Speak Out in Shankleville, with the purpose being of learning about the role of story and memory, and specifically how that led to action. And so at that event, I began asking the same questions that I ask to this day. Semi-structured interview questions about where these places are, what their names are, what's the story, events and traditions, preservation activities, relationship with government planners, settlement challenges. All of these were the types of interview questions that I not only asked at that event in 2015, but in several interactions throughout those counties. And all of those interactions led to the map on the right. So the map on the left has 14 settlements. And if I look in the book Freedom Colonies by Thad Sitton and Conrad, they'll tell me in these 2 counties, this is how many settlements you have. But after archival research, interviews, personal archival research with descendant communities, walking tours, all of the ways in which I engaged the landscape and people in these landscapes, the real footprint or the counter narratives really created this counter map. And so by geocoding the materials and the photos taken in these places, I was able to identify these settlements, which they alternatively sometimes call Black pockets. So I found that storytelling was really a method It made visible places visible. It was a way to engage in youth knowledge transfer, because we know youth engagement is a huge problem in these communities. But I found the ways in which they leverage story and memory transfer to actually get young people involved. Homecoming rituals helped reconstruct place narratives. They were at a time when they would witness to the existence of place, and local knowledge is intangible and vulnerable in these contexts, but still valued and deployed. In that, diasporic and place-based identity in freedom colonies was very real. Homecoming as diaspora, as assemblage, was part of reconstructing place and place narrative. And these places, though reproduced episodically at events, through embodiment, through acknowledgement, through memory, they were made real in the imaginary, in the imagination, and in the practice of people's return and reason for return. And that self-naming of settlements and memory transference reproduced place-based identity. And so what also came out of this research, 2015 to 2016, from a group of the descendants in which I began working with, was an agenda. And of this agenda, there were a few items that I, as a researcher, as a tenure track professor, thought I could reasonably make some headway on. Centralized location for information, facilitating communication among descendants, their partnerships with institutions of higher learning, and developing a learning community with annual meetings and a symposium. Those were the pieces where I thought I could make some headway. And so I mentioned before all the ways that I went about doing the work: methods, data sources. I'm one researcher in 2 counties, and also exploring 2 major cities and talking to 48 descendants, using all of these different ethnographic and historical research methodologies and social science methodologies. And I thought, well, how much more could I do if the Texas Freedom Colonies project, which emerged out of this, I expressed this as a Texas Freedom Colonies project because I wanted to communicate it as not just a dissertation project, but as something that was going to persist past my commitment as a doctoral student. And so we have a model for the way we do work with the Texas Freedom Colonies project: connect and collect, countermap, co-create. We connect through social media, workshops, and events. We collect and protect through field ethnography, an intranet for holding data, atlas, an online atlas in Black digital humanities, and we co-create through participatory action research and heritage conservation, and by countermapping, which is what our online atlas helps us to do. And the principles are listed here, but I'll just illuminate cultural humility, valuing local knowledge, triangulation of data, and centering people in their stories. And so the relationship between counter-narratives and place preservation is thus: dominant narratives about place are pregnant with, integrity, significance, tenure, all of these ways that we think about place attachment. And that counter-narratives contest those assumptions about place because they depict historic Black settlements as typically transgressive, as diasporic, and as embodied. And these counter-narratives still help reconstruct place, and counterpublics, that is these diasporic communities, use counter-narratives to promote a place preservation agenda. So what we do to support that is we support documentation, we provide trainings, we have online libraries of information and resources, and I train students to specialize in the various areas of need. The needs are great. And so the Texas Freedom Colonies project purpose is to cultivate and grow scholars who can, with great depth, focus in on the various challenges that face historic Black settlements. So we have educational resources. We have group meetings. This is our research network, now known as our Adopt a County program, meeting with our neighborhood revitalization students to learn about what is a freedom colony and also how can we improve the atlas and make it user-friendly. We also have a strategic plan and mobile assessment tool initiative that's been going on from 2018 to 2021, in which we both thought holistically about how to grow a more robust online platform to support offline engagement. This happened, of course, amidst the pandemic, So it took a little longer, but we finally were able to develop a plan, and we were also able to test our cemetery registry tool in the field with descendant communities. So we wanted to both increase the number of settlements that we located, build capacity, and address those systemic issues at the same time while we're expanding our online presence. And I mentioned the Atlas. Why an Atlas? Why a Black Digital World of Worlds? To address barriers to place preservation in planning processes, to collect and aggregate secure data, to shift away from a property-only approach to historical properties, increase their visibility strategically, and spatialize vulnerabilities, and increase access to data. So here are our sources, everything from all of those officially recognized sources that you would say, oh, did you look in this first? Yes. And then we look in those type of resources people upload through our online survey to the Atlas, which populate those points. In our latest article that I've published in AAG, we talk about how Black women's emotional geographies actually help us to explain and depict place using the story of Miss Cynthia Matlock. And I share this story to give you an example of what people upload and to have you note the wealth of information in less than 200 words that people share through the Atlas. These are just other examples of the images and data that people upload that help them reconstruct the existence of places with little to no remaining population. And this is our Atlas dashboard. So again, I tell everyone this is publicly available, and the point of the Atlas is for people to put things in it. So very often people are like, well, what's that for? And how do I get to it? This is for the public to use and to add to. It's not much without the public, without descendant communities adding their stories. We've located and verified 430. We have 214 forms of input into the Atlas from the public. And we have 84 settlements for which we think they might be settlements, but they need more research to fully verify that. And we have 105 settlement names that we have yet to officially locate. So what's the implications? What are the implications rather? Or what's the point? Mapping place histories makes disparate impacts visible when spatialized. When we're able to translate memories, stories to points, and then turn points into multi-dimensional depictions of place, we can, I think, increase communication pathways to increase access to discourse and policymakers, because we are depicting that information in a way that translates in those spaces. We should invest in both on and offline consultation and engagement innovations, of which I think the Atlas could become that for National Park Service and others. And I think it could also help us face the inevitable false dichotomies that are about to face us as we look more and more towards Build Back Better, right? And those, the rush to build needed infrastructure, and seeing preservation as a process that's nothing but red tape, and seeing infrastructure as nothing but something that destroys communities. We have an inevitable clash, which will mean some unpacking of the dominant narratives and the very real history informing those situations and those circumstances. The Atlas layers stories and risk, increases visibility, shows intersection of cultural assets and infrastructure risk. And what you see here is one of those depictions of risk. All of those lines are Texas Department of Transportation future projects and their intersection with Freedom Colonies. So it's not about one episode or one particular problem, it's systemic. And with that, I welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. That was fantastic. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the stage two graduate students whose work overlaps with Dr. Roberts, and we'll begin our Q&A by asking Dr. Roberts a few questions. I thought to ask these two students, Jade Ryerson and Amber Delgado, because both share an interest in how diverse communities create space in and lay claim to the built environment, and how the histories of these places inform and give urgency to movements for justice and social equity in the present. Jade Ryerson is a first-year student in the Heritage Studies and Public History Master's Program with an emphasis on historic preservation. She's written extensively about the places where BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and working class women made history for the National Park Service Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education. And her current research focuses on the history of 6th Avenue North in Minneapolis, a vibrant corridor for Black and Jewish-owned businesses and music venues in North Minneapolis that was disrupted by the construction of Olson Memorial Highway during the late 1930s. Amber Delgado is currently a second-year master's student in Heritage Studies and Public History. As an Afro-Peruvian Southerner, she's always thinking about the politics and cultural production of space. Her research interests include gentrification, public memory, and Black feminist theory. Her capstone project currently involves collaborating with public housing residents on the history and necessity of public housing in Minneapolis through the form of a zine. So I'll turn it over to Amber and Jade.
Oh, do you want to go first, Jade? Or?
Oh, sure. Thank you. We're both being too polite, I think, right now. I'm also still a little starstruck by your talk, Dr. Roberts, so I think that's part of it. Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask you a question. I'm an Asian American woman in my 20s with shoulder-length Black hair, and I use she, her pronouns also. Dr. Roberts, my question for you is based on your discussion about how power, and more specifically the white gaze, are embedded in planning policies and historic preservation standards. Because the significance of the Freedom Colonies is derived from their independence from white surveillance, to what extent would it still be useful or suitable to designate them within that framework of existing preservation tools and standards?
And that is the million-dollar question. Seriously, it really is. As I sit on the State Board of Review as someone who is supposed to translate significance. I mean, I really see that's the purpose of my being in the belly of the beast, so to speak, right? It's not so much to say, yeah, National Register, everything's cool. Standards are great. I think that's a red herring in a way, though, for us to get really tied up in the standards, to the extent that there's a lot that can be done and can be used and can be deployed in service of protection of these places. And it's sometimes a choice, meaning you could look at some of the ways that communities in, I think it was Arizona. I met a SHPO from Arizona, and there were particular creative ways that they found to protect whole landscapes. And someone else could make the same decision using the same regulations not to. So my point is not to let people off the hook and say, well, it's all about people and not regulations. I think that designation serves a particular purpose for individuals who are pursuing it. I have a colleague, Michelle Magalong at University of Maryland, who I have this conversation with, who works to get Asian Pacific Islander community-oriented sites and historic sites on the National Register. And she will dispute you in a minute and say, this is very important to these people. In her, her constituency, who she works for, this is very important. And so I think there has to be a level of respect for what this type of recognition means to certain generations. Having a sign, having a medallion means something to a certain population. So I don't want to dismiss that. But I will say that we're not very good at translating what that designation means in terms of whether or not the site will still be standing if a road comes through, whether or not that site it's wonderful to be on the National Register, and if it's commercial, it could be eligible for tax credits, but then it could become something that totally dwarfs and destroys its former character. And I think that's frankly an area where we need a lot of work, is what happens to tax credit properties, for example. So I would say that, we have to unpack what we expect and what we think that designations are about. and what they, and be very honest with the public about what they afford you legally and don't. But I think we also have to recognize and respect those for which that form of recognition is meaningful.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts, so much for your presentation today. I got so much out of it. I took so many notes and your critically important work as well. My question is kind of broad, but hopefully it can become more concentrated as I go on. I moved to Minneapolis from Durham, North Carolina in 2020 for this program. And it was when I moved to Durham, North Carolina from Fayetteville, North Carolina, I learned about Polly Murray's house. For those who aren't familiar, Polly Murray is a very famous figure in Durham, North Carolina. And her house was on the brink of being destroyed and is now in the process of being turned into a cultural space in Durham. So I'm just, as you were talking, I'm just thinking about how are we just now here in recognizing the importance of these spaces? And as a result of which, again, this question is kind of broad, but with the narratives and counter narratives and kind of, as you were mentioning in the beginning, this assumption of neutrality within preservation, my general question is, can the state be trusted to eventually recognize worth if it's like embedded in so much, frankly, anti-Blackness and just not being able to like recognize the importance of these spaces to begin with?
So I'd like to kind of engage just like a discussion more with you, because immediately the question that came up as you were positing that to, or posing that to me was, okay, then what does the state owe us?
Mm.
So a given, the state's going to get it wrong.
Yeah.
It has its own biases to reinforce its own power, of course, like any other institution. But what does it owe us? What does it owe people of color? What does it owe laborers? What does it owe women? And so I very much look at this pursuit of protections, recognitions, et cetera, as not like, if I just get that in the form that it is, that it's going to protect, it's going to give us what we need, it's going to, you know, fortify our communities and all of that, but that these tools do hold some power. And we can either say, okay, fine, you can't build a master's house, a master's tool, blah, blah, all that. But then there's what is right now. And so I think it's a challenge, but I think we have to be very forward looking about, like, I'll give you a concrete example. Traditional cultural properties is not just for Native American communities. There are individuals here, you're all in historic preservation, you're like, I know that, but I promise you there are a lot of professionals and there are a lot of SHPO offices and coordinators of register programs that either, number one, would say, well, it's not really supposed to be used for anything other than Native Americans. Or they would say, yeah, but I think that's really complicated and I don't think that that's going to prove muster, and you know, I just don't think. Meanwhile, it's been used, you know, along the Gullah corridor with sweetgrass, you know, basket makers, and that whole landscape is considered traditional cultural properties because that custom happens along the way. What is the point? The point is that there are tools we should be using and we're not using them. And it's, you know, using the traditional cultural property designation or a form of, you know, of designation doesn't necessarily mean that we're giving in to the state by doing so. What we are doing, however, is elevating landscape and cultural practice as a valid way to determine that a place or a landscape needs to be protected. And that's very valuable if you're thinking about, please don't, you know, widen the highway anymore, right? And so I think about those kind of circumstances to attend to, not at the exclusion of critiquing the concept of designation in the first place. But I think it's important for us to fully, understand what we have at our disposal and what it can do.
I agree completely. One of the things I wanted to add on to that question as well is it sounds like the ways in which this is happening is through people who have connections to those communities to be like the main person to lead that. I guess I'm getting at, without BIPOC people in those positions, it seems like the structure itself isn't like able to render worth to these very important historical places. And I'm just expressing frustration that it seems like it's so common, has to be led by us.
Yes, but I also think, preservation being synonymous with being white, older, a woman, and using it as a leisure activity is something that we can only dismantle by changing the face of historic preservation and by changing who is in the field. While it is frustrating, I think what I found when a lot of predominantly white organizations attempt to do that work that we would like them to do, they still manifest or propagate these same ideas of superiority. And like, there's a dynamic in these organizations, even when they attempt to be so-called inclusive, with the idea that they're including you into the norm. And I'm doing this for you. So there's a whole dynamic here, right? That has to be challenged and reconstructed. So the process of the preservation work matters. Who is doing it matters.
Amber and Jade, any other questions from either of you?
I mean, I guess on that last note about process, this recalls like also how you were discussing like preservation, especially of intangible heritage, as like a form of maintaining like resilience of a community. And I think that's something, I mean, I don't necessarily know if this is necessarily a question so much as like, I thought that was a really interesting point that you made. If you could say more about preservation as a form of like community resilience and yeah.
I think it's a step. So I'll take an active example. I'm working with Washington County. You saw an example or two of some of their historic Black settlements when I showed you the uploads to the Atlas. The Camptown Cemetery is part of a settlement called Camptown. Post Oak Grove is also a settlement, and you saw some posters and church cornerstone. The individuals involved with that community are called an African-American content community, and they're part of a mainstream, Brenham Museum, and it's an African-American subgroup that's really committed to more African-American content in public history. I initially met those people, and you saw some of them in the posters, like sitting at computers in 2018 and 2019. And then in 2021, they were like, we're trying to do an exhibit. Could you come in and help us with this exhibit? While they're trying to do the final exhibit for the new museum, we're going to put this together. Could you get your team of students and help us to do that? Then the next step is, in the course of doing this, Dr. Roberts, we kind of figured out we kind of need our own thing. And we also need a place to do our own thing. I have a student, he's a master's architecture student. Maybe he could help you, he could give you some options or envision what that Mount Zion Church in Watersville could become. That's the tangible piece, right? What can and can't come of that, but you need momentum and you need a way for people a cause to remember, right? And so these constructed, like, let's come together and do a workshop on oral histories so that we can get those oral histories and make them part of the exhibits, but also let's teach people here how to conduct an oral history. So I guess what I'm saying is that they're all steps. I wouldn't say because we did this, then they're resilient. I would say these are processes that can catalyze or support people's efforts to be resilient in the face of larger communities that would have them not be part of public history otherwise.
Thanks again, Amber and Jade. Any other questions from you two? Well, Dr. Roberts, we'll turn to some questions that have been asked by the broader audience. Somebody asks, in regards to the Texas Freedom Colonies Atlas, I'm interested to hear about the process of collecting and storing community narratives. How have you approached keeping communities in control of their narratives, and how those narratives are used, i.e. shared authority? Is there a curation process for the stories? Who's involved in that process?
Right. So there's a few ways in which we fall short. I have aspirations for us to do this, completely, descendant driven, I'm just here to host the tech kind of way of doing things. But there's some people that are really interested in, how do I do this right? Yeah, how do we use the Atlas correctly? How do we, input things into, because they want to learn how to survey for other purposes. They want to learn the tech and all of that. And so the co-creation part becomes critiques of the Atlas. So we've had surveys and certain user experience things that we have modified in reaction to descendants saying, you know what, I don't really want that. I want this, or I need more room for this. And we don't, this doesn't come out of a box. We're just it's like a Franken platform. It's like Story Map and Google 123 Survey, and it's all of these plugins. It's as we go, iteratively figuring it out. There is no like, here's the thing. I have no programmer who's like making it all perfect for me. That's not what this is. So it's a very, learning as we go. The other co-creation part happens, or co-curation, is in events we have where we invite people to come and scan materials. And we don't just say, give it to me. We have workshops to say, these are your rights. This is what Creative Commons is. This is what it means for us to have custodial rights. When you go somewhere else, you can tell them how long you want them to have access. So we all use every opportunity to educate people about their rights and who has access to what. And we don't show everything that people put in. So when you go to the Atlas, you're not going to see names and phone numbers and email addresses. You're not going to see a lot of kind of back-end information that wouldn't be really good to share. We call people and say, oh, we'd like to recognize you and feature you in the monthly newsletter, and we'd like you to be recognized for sharing this story. But that's where we are right now. We are actually have a doctoral student and one of our digital librarians here at the university thinking through how are some other ways that we can better articulate what we're doing to forefront descendant communities having so-called control, meaning, there's IRB. If people say, hey, we have the IRB at the top of every one of the surveys. So if you see the survey, you're like, oh gosh, what is all this junk here? But it is, and you have to confirm you've read it. So we have all of these ways that we try to work in, informed consent, right?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for this fascinating talk, and thank you for the work you're doing. I'd love to hear more about how the story of the Freedom Colonies relates to the perceived dichotomy between infrastructure development and historic preservation.
Right. So I think that we have communities of color that have been purposefully underserved and have not had the infrastructure investment that they should. Same time, we have had freeways cut communities like Freedmanstown in Houston, for example, in half. Or we could talk about the way it bifurcated communities in Dallas. Okay, so that's infrastructure doing harm. but we need infrastructure. So we need to be able to have those conversations at the same time. And so I saw a great article, I cannot remember the source of it right now, that was about how infrastructure harms communities and the danger of infrastructure to these historic communities. And I thought, oh my gosh, absolutely great article. But then there's some people saying, you know, I no longer want a ditch here. How about that? You don't know what it's like to live with, you know, poor water sewer. And I think we need to have larger, broader conversations about how these things are true at the same time and hold them at the same time. And that's what I mean to say. This is actually something I've, you know, tried to write about and tried to pitch. And some people are like, but I don't get it. It's either this or it's that. So that's the dichotomy piece here, is being able to hold that cognitive dissonance about what progress is and how we need to do things differently.
Thank you. That's helpful to the work I've been doing recently with freeways with students.
Oh, yeah.
As well.
Mm-hmm.
Another question. I was struck by many points, but I'm curious in particular about your turn to Black women's, quote, emotional geographies, unquote, in the counter mapping of Black freedom colonies. What's at stake in calling these emotional? The origin story of Cynthia Matlock you shared certainly is rooted in family history and in kinship community ties, but the quoted excerpt rings sober, not especially emotional. Are you contesting the dominant tendency to imagine only knowledge that can be verified as cold, hard fact, as correct knowledge? Are you making space for personal history rooted in memory that may or may not always be verifiable as an equally valid ground for the historical preservation of Black communities?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So this is when I say that thing that, you know, we academics always say, well, if you would read my article. And I say that because the article has just been out a week, okay? And contending with palimpsest about Black women's emotional geographies. And in the longer excerpt, which was not included in this presentation, the emotional is at the forefront because she is remembering a natural space, okay? Not just with those facts and figures offered there, but also about what she ate and how safe she felt in her freedom colony growing up, and what she liked to pick and eat from the land. And, you know, there's a reclaiming of that emotionality that has to happen, I think, to reacquaint our thinking about the natural and African Americans. You know, there's been this divide of African Americans in nature. In recent years, it's coming together. You got your podcast, you got, you know, all types of African-American groups that are about hiking and those sort of things, right? But that's a very, very recent phenomenon. And so the work of this article is to not only say that the emotional matters, but it's essential to understanding these landscapes and what freedom is in these landscapes. And also myself and my co-author, Dr. Maya Butler, who's a literary theorist, you know, I'm an urban planner writing with the literary theorist in a geography journal. And so that's our intervention here, is talking about literary geography and also, you know, pushing against academia that would say, okay, you know, what's the place of this emotionality in academia? How are you supposed to manage it or put it in a box? So we're also contemplating and pushing up against that in the piece as well. So the excerpt, yes, is very straight on to say, look at the legitimate facts that this is pregnant with. And also when you read the other excerpts, you'll see the explicitly emotional, and it's how essential it is to understanding what a free Black space is.
Thank you again. Another question. Would you mind saying something about your work on re-envisioning design history? Maybe by talking about the seminar in Washington, D.C. this summer at Dumbarton Oaks?
Ooh, that feels like two questions. So I think the re-envisioning of design makes me think of work like Dr. Tara Dudley, who's just come out with a great book about builders in New Orleans, for example. That there's some retroactive work around validating and elevating Black builders as design thinkers. So there's that. Set that aside, the box of cool. And then when I think of what's happening this summer at Dumbarton Oaks, that's a very landscape-based focused work. And I think of the work of my friend Julie McGilvery, who's with the National Park Service. And when we first met 2011, 2012, and she introduced, kind of cultural landscape thinking to me, along with some others, she said the landscape is everything. And so when we're talking about cultural landscapes in Washington, DC, and about centering cultural landscapes that tell the story of DC from a Black and Indigenous perspective or history or positionality, we're doing all of that in service of learning how these populations made the place and are authors of the place and designed the place that we call the district. So that's how I would tie the two together.
Thank you. Thank you for your informative, engaging presentation. As a student researching oral traditions and memories to reinterpret and reconstitute a historical period that is completely written only by one party. This is a student who's working on the history of Somalia. I wanted to ask if you could speak more about orality, memory, and history, specifically as to how it relates to other disciplines and the narratives that are taken over by European epistemologies and education.
So I think about, I mentioned status narratives, but there is the power of individual memory and narratives. I took a wonderful course with an African feminist scholar whose name is escaping me because I'm getting old. But she is the one who kind of introduced me to these different forms or types of memory and what is the power of individual memory, right? Which seems to be what you're asking is, the moral and correct treatment of individual memory. And sometimes that's the only memory, right? And I would only flip that and say, then what happens when you have multiple memories about the same event or place? So the moral thing that we do at Texas Freedom Colonies Project, or like the moral, kind of impulse that drives us, is not to say we found the settlement and we have our story, we're done with that settlement. We invite multiple stories about every point on the map. And we want everybody to see all of those entries. And so some people come to the map and like, give me the answer. And I would say that it's more important that we depict transparently this process right now of people offering up their multiple narratives from all of these positionalities, while concurrently we do produce a blue point that says this is a combination of facts that substantiate this place exists, while leaving up all those other different color dots where you can see 3 different people who put in public input and read everything that they said the way they said it. So that's our way of kind of looking at the individual as well as, these other notions of defining the place.
Thank you. Someone writes, wow, the Texas Freedom Colonies website and project are amazing. Wonder about the types of connections that could be made between the Native Land Back movement and Black land movement that preserves historical sites, archives, and their histories and supports the communities living in these spaces.
That is what is next. When I say what is next is that's percolating and it won't move forward effectively, I think, until I'm doing this work in community. So when I say, oh, well, yeah, this is next, what I mean to say is that cultivating these relationships with other people who are doing bridge work between African Americans and Indigenous community, like Marguerite Smith and there we go with names again, T.L. King, who are either discursively working through the Black and Indigenous experience, or literally working through the Black and Indigenous experience of what it is to have land claims or construct what a land claim is. It's fraught, it's complicated, and it has to do, I think, a lot with relationship. So yes, there's all these possibilities, absolutely. There's people already, bridging across those communities. I just want to be very intentional, because I learned, it's a grounded theory here. I learned how to do this work from the context in which I work. So I wouldn't rightly say, I'll just extrapolate what happened in these contexts to this context right away. I have things to learn from Native American groups and contexts that I don't know yet. So it'd be kind of arrogant to say, yeah, I'll just put that up there and do the same thing. But yes, I see the connections and I'm interested in the possibilities, and I'm hoping to work with and bring value to folks who are doing that work.
Thank you. Do you have any reading recommendations on other Black scholars or heritage practitioners thinking through Black place, community survival, and freedom fugitivity?
Fugitivity, Jessica Marie Johnson, historian and digital humanities, Black digital humanities scholar. I would really recommend reading her. Reading her online. She has several online platforms in which she's curating African diaspora, and particularly women in the African diaspora. So I definitely would look to her. I think I would look to, what is her name, her first name? Gumps is her last name, based in North Carolina, independent scholar. I would look to the online journal. It's not really a journal, Places journal. It is a journal, but they have a number of reading lists. I composed a reading list for Places journal. This woman that I'm mentioning, last name Gumps, composed a reading list, right? And so I think it is very much about sometimes looking outside of preservation to get your answers. Because that's where I get my answers. I would say, yeah, those are two women that immediately come to mind. Yes, thank you, Alexis. Oh, how embarrassing. Thank you so much, Amber. Yes, Alexis Gumps. But I'll certainly think of more, but I would say, selfishly, read more of the work of not just those women, read more pieces. I'm glad to know that some get assigned, but there, are pieces here and there of mine that maybe you would find of interest, and check the citations and check the Journal of Community Archaeology and Heritage. That's a great journal. It has the work of a lot of people who do anthropology, archaeology, community archaeology and heritage, I believe, that do participatory archaeology work. People in African diaspora anthropology and archaeology are your people. They innovate, especially historical archaeology, are doing the work that have really inspired and shaped my work. People like, on my dissertation committee that do a lot of African diaspora anthropology or archaeology work. There's Terry Myers in Texas, who's a practitioner who does a lot of National Register nominations with this kind of spirit and thinking. And then I'll think of more, but I think those are a few.
Thanks again. One last question. Understanding what makes a place and documenting these significant places and communities is so important. Are you also thinking about documenting movement among places, migration routes, and connections?
Yes, I have a dream project about the Texas-California migration and gospel music. Yes. Now, what is that all about? what would that be for? I couldn't rightly tell you, but I'm deeply fascinated about Pentecostalism because I grew up in it, and how it originally started as a very populist movement, the Azusa, awakening in Los Angeles, California, and all of these people who originally came from Texas, who were African-American, combined with this mixed group of women and whites and others, and emerged out of it a very transgressive populist movement that then turned to a racialized white, right wing split. They were once one movement and then split. And in the course of all that happening, there built up a large, religious kind of population, and gospel music, with a lot of movement between Texas and California. So that's sort of like my next kind of thing that I've started to think about in terms of migration, right? This back and forth of the California, Texas, the, important people in California who originally were from Texas, like Willie Brown, San Francisco, all of these people. What is that? What does that constitute? And, how does that migration happen? And how does it make California, California? Right. So that's one of those kind of fantastical migration stories that I'm thinking about, but I'm also thinking about how migration driven by racial violence is part of the creation stories of these places. And that's something I'm writing about right now.
If I may ask one last question as the moderator, to take us back to the beginning. And it's maybe a little bit wonky, but it's a question that my students and I debate a lot. Do you think the historic preservation laws in the United States and its policies, did they need to change? Or is it that the interpretation of these laws need to change, and perhaps more so the people who are interpreting them? It's
Both.
like both. Yeah.
Honestly, it's both, because I've witnessed people do the right thing and do creative great things. And I'm like, well, the laws are still crappy, but they did that. Why is that? I just really think it's important to acknowledge the people who are managing to make those things happen. And I'm about to write, there's another article coming out soon that'll give an example of someone who pushed the envelope and said, yes, this has enough integrity. Yes. In my opinion, still not enough. We needed a cultural landscape scale for recognition, but it was a huge coup or a win to be able to recognize this building that had layers of paint on it. It still had its windows, it still had its, view shed of a certain perspective. And so they were able to make that argument about the significance in spite of someone else who may see the integrity and go, no, not going to make it. But I think it's both. I think, this very concept of integrity, I don't think it has to totally be thrown out in the trash, but I do think we have to question and challenge what it's really for, right? It's a smokescreen for something else. And it builds in a structural racism because of the reason why integrity in buildings decay in the first place and what causes that to happen.
For the audience, Dr. Roberts and I are talking about integrity. It's usually preservationists use this word integrity to refer to the intactness of a historic building. To what extent does it look historic? Does it look like it did when it was historic? And
yes,
unpacking that term a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks again, Dr. Roberts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Gunn to wrap things up. Thank you so much for coming.
And I just want to add my thanks to all of you for being here, to Dr. Roberts, to Greg, to Jade, to Amber. This has really been a fabulous conversation, and we appreciate it so much. And we'll look for you next week, either in cyberspace or in the Best Buy Theater for the Spotlight series. Thank you, everybody.